Well, with just 2 more days to go to actual polling day, this afternoon we are going to examine the other kind of election poll, the public opinion poll. With us are Humphrey Taylor of the Lewis Harris poll and Dr. Bill Belson, who is an independent research consultant. And first, gentlemen, could I ask you very briefly but very bluntly, what went wrong last time, 4 years ago in the general election, when nearly all, well, 4 out of 5 polls were wrong?
There were probably a number of different causes, but undoubtedly the most important cause of the errors, if you like, of the polls was the time factor, that they stopped polling much too soon, and the earlier a poll stopped polling before polling day, the worse its error.
Would you agree with that?
Yes, but I go further. I don't think we really know for sure just what went wrong, but there are a number of possibilities, and I think we should think about them all. But let me just summarize them for you.
Yeah.
There's a possibility of sampling error. We'll be hearing more about that, I'm sure. And then there's a possibility that something happened at the last event between the poll and the actual election. Then again, there's a possibility of trouble with the questions themselves, question misunderstanding. You can't rule out either the possibility that interviewers enter into the situation in some way. It's what one calls interviewer bias. And then just to add one more, there's a possibility of a late bandwagon effect.
So really what you're saying is that the public opinion polls are unpredictable, even though they, according to the public, predict the eventual result.
That's right. All a poll can do is to measure with a greater or lesser degree of accuracy what the public is thinking at the time that it interviews them.
Now, how are these measurements done? For instance, the selection of questions must be very important, as Dr. Belson just said.
Well, we ask, of course, a whole range of different questions in any one survey, but the key question, I suppose, is the one which actually tries to measure how the people are likely to vote. And there are a number of different ways in which that can be asked. For example, one question is, if the general election were to be held today, how do you think you would vote? Another variation of that is, if there was a general election tomorrow, which party would you support? Another variation, how would you vote in a general election now? Another variation, how do you think you will vote at the general election? Another variation, how do you think you will vote at the general election on February the 28th? Now, these are all slightly different ways of asking the same kind of question.
They hardly seem momentous in their differences to me. Do they have that much influence on response?
We don't really know as much as we should about that, but I think they do have a slight difference, yes.
You think?
Well, we have some evidence on some of them.
Now, you must know, rather than think, the people those questions were asked of. How do you select the people, the panel, the group?
Well, there are several different ways of selecting the sample, but the key thing with any sample is that it must be representative of the different groups in society.
And how are those groups broken down?
And I suppose the most important groups are, first of all, sex. We need to get the correct proportions of men and of women. I think we actually have a caption, yes. We have 47% of men in the electorate and 53% of women, slightly more women.
So obviously women have the electoral power.
Well, they have the bulk of it, yes. Then, of course, we need to get the correct proportion in each age group. Again, we have a slide. You'll see at the top of that, the 65-plus group, the old age pensioners group, is the largest single slice, if you like, of that cake. And indeed, there are now something like 8 million people over 65 in the electorate.
Does that mean, really, that the majority of the electorate is over 65?
No, 20% of it is, 1 in 5, but that's a very large chunk.
But compared to the other age proportions that we saw there...
It's bigger than any of the other age groups.
I see. And then the next group, I suppose, would have something to do with incomes or income tax paying?
The British don't like to talk about their incomes very much, and it's a difficult question to ask. So what we actually do is to divide the electorate into various, what we call socio-economic groups, which are basically
have to do with
groups.
Income?
Well, particularly with occupation. What jobs do people do? And if you look at the diagram there, you see on the left-hand side, we've got a quite small group who are the professional, managerial, if you like, upper middle and middle class group. Then we have the white-collar group, which goes over 20%, the second one from the left, white-collar, lower middle class. Then we have the largest single group, which is skilled manual workers, which goes over 30%. Then we have unskilled manual workers to the right of that, going down the right-hand side. And then at the extreme right-hand side, we have the the relatively least affluent group, the poor, the unemployed, and so on.
So to recap, your ideal voter would be a female old-age pensioner who is a skilled manual worker.
Well, there's no one voter who's ideal, and that would certainly not be representative of the electorate as a whole. No, no one person could be, possibly.
But you use these figures and these facts and these averages to find a kind of sample group that you think reflects the electorate.
We choose our sample in such a way as to get the correct proportion in each of these groups, and if we are, in fact, slightly deficient in any of these groups, we will weight our sample, apply an arithmetic formula to it to adjust for that omission.
Can I ask you about one of the most interesting political parties that I think exists in this country or in any other country, and that is the mysterious floating voter. Who is he or she?
Well, there used to be an idea that the overwhelming majority of people in the population were firmly committed to one party or the other, and there was just a few percent, 5 or 6 or 10% of people who were described as floating voters. In fact, it's really very much larger than that. We have a chart here which shows something of it. It may even underestimate the true floating vote. Now, perhaps I can explain it.
Yes.
The extreme left-hand column indicates the Conservative vote in a recent Harris poll, just ahead, as you can see, of the Labour vote. Down a long way, then, is the Liberal vote, and of course that's actually come up a bit since then, but it's obviously still smaller than the two large parties. Then we have the Nationalists, those who would not vote, those who say they don't know, those who don't give us an answer, and one or two others at the end there.
All the
Now,
light colours then
yes.
are put together?
Now, all the light colours are people who are, at best, loosely committed to a party or not committed at all. We have a bit of those who we count as Conservative, really very loosely committed to the Conservative Party, and so on. If we add all the light bits together, we get, in fact, a total of 6 million voters, which is a pretty sizable chunk, and, of course, enough, if it swings together one way or the other, to create a landslide.
Now, you've mentioned the word swing, which is one of those electoral words that we hear, we read, and in fact, I do not understand it. The swing.
Yes. Well, the swing is a formula used to explain a movement between one party and another. And the problem with the British electorate is that a very small swing creates a very large movement in the House of Commons, of course. Now, a 1% swing, which would convert a 1% Conservative lead into a 1% Labour lead, means that only one person in every 100 has actually changed his voting intention. 1 person in 100 doesn't sound very much, but of course it's 400,000 voters. And it's enough to change a Conservative victory into a Labour victory. If you take it a bit larger than that, take a 2% swing, we have here 1 person every 50 changing their mind, which is 800,000 voters, and that changes a 2% Conservative lead into a 2% Labour lead.
So we have swing, and then we have the other mysterious fellow called margin of error. We've the mysterious floating voter, the mysterious swing, and the margin of error, which has nothing to do with swing.
No. There are many different kinds of error, many different kinds, of which we've discussed some. When people talk about the margin of error, however, they normally are referring to a particular source of error, which is random sampling error. And we have a little toy here which actually explains, I think, fairly well what we're talking about. Perhaps I can just hold this up. Now, we have at the top here a lot of tiny little balls that look rather like powder, I think, on the screen. And each one of those represents one opinion poll. So we've got, if you like, 500 opinion polls all locked away in this bit at the top here. Now, when I pull the plunger out here, you will see how those scatter. And in understanding what happens, we must look upon the centre of this box as being the truth. Any ball which falls down the middle is producing a very accurate measurement of the truth. The further away from the centre that it falls, the less accurate is that opinion poll. I hope it works. Now, you'll see as the little balls are falling down, they're tending to go in the centre of this pyramid, or if you like, U, upside down U here, but some are falling right at the two extremes. We therefore find that the great majority of polls are very close to the centre and are therefore very accurate. However, we get some which are a bit off, we get a few which are a very long way off, and therefore even with the best the best poll, perfectly run, we will always find a few polls, the odd poll, which is seriously inaccurate. In other words, it falls some way to either side of the centre.
Do you know, it all seems very unfair to me. It seems as if you have inbuilt excuses. You say, of course, there's the swing factor, which means that 1% becomes 2%, margins of error, the random factor in the dust falling down there. If a child went to their maths master and said, I'm putting in my paper, but of course there's a margin of error, so I might be 6% out or 6% up. It's not fair, is it? Can't we improve, or can't you improve the accuracy of polls? Is there no way?
Well,
Dr.
of course we can. Yes, yes.
Yes, there are all sorts of things that can be done, but they take time, and above all, they take money. I can tell you briefly what they are if you'd like me to.
I'd like to. Do you think the polls are accurate?
I think a proportion of them are inaccurate, and I think that there is less accuracy or more inaccuracy than we need have.
Right.
And I think there's something we can do about it, and I'm sure that the polling organisations feel just the same way about it, but money and work is necessary.
Well,
one thing you can do...
Why not tell Humphrey Taylor what to do, not me?
Well, one thing that can be done is to try to match or weight back or to equate your sample, when you've got it, more and more and more to the population it's meant to represent. And that'll mean that you go beyond, say, age and sex, if they're slightly out of balance, and you take more. Of course, the things that you equate in, you make your sample equal to the population in.
Take more in what sense? A larger sample or a more accurate sample?
Well, a larger sample is one answer to it, but it's very expensive to do that. But there's another way of doing it, and that is to do what we call weighting of the sample back to the population it is supposed to represent. Some of these ones, that the way out cases we looked at, are there for all sorts of odd reasons. Some people may say chance. I don't personally believe in chance. Something did it. And I think that we can reduce what does it. Sometimes there'll be a way out there because by rotten luck we've got a bad sample. We haven't got representative people. It may turn out that way. Well, if we learn about all the characteristics of people that are related to voting behaviour and try to equate our sample to the population in terms of those things, then we're probably going to cut out some of those way out inaccuracies. That's one thing you can do.
But most polls do use random sampling, don't they, where it's almost like tossing a name up in a hat, a lot of names up in a hat?
Indeed, yes. I mean, the two main methods used by the polls, if you would like me to tell you about them, are basically random sampling and quota sampling. In a random sample, one takes names of voters from the electoral registers, stirs them, if you like, in a kind of computerized hat, and then gives the names of those people to the interviewers and say, interview them. If they're not there today, go back tomorrow. If they're not there this afternoon, go back tonight. The other method, a quota sample, an interviewer has a description of different kinds of people, different age groups, different sexes, different socioeconomic groups, working and non-working housewives and so on, and they have to find people who fit into all those different types.
Well, that seems to me more sensible than just tossing up the hat.
The problem with that method, which is a real problem, which Bill is certainly very much aware of, is the interviewer selection problem, that the interviewer has the final choice as to whom to interview, whereas with a random sample, the interviewer has no choice.
After all, if you're going along, you're calling a particular house and there's a savage-looking dog in front of it and there's a nice, kind lady in the next one, there's a possibility that you may go next door if she more or less fits. But the trouble, of course, you don't get out of all your trouble just by taking a random sample, because particularly when you have a very short time to do the survey in, you have to find time for these callbacks, calling again and again to catch people are out. If you don't, then you're asking yourself, well, what sort of people didn't I catch? There's your problem. And of course, there are other difficulties about the random method. By and large, it's a much safer sort of technique, but both of them do have their problems.
I would like to go back to something that you mentioned very quickly at the beginning of the program, and that is the precision of the questions and the sort of inbuilt checks that should be in the questions.
Yes. The form of the question is very important indeed.
Is it like, have you stopped beating your wife? As simple as that?
Well, I don't think many people do that sort of thing. It's more or less the copybook example of what you shouldn't do. Some villains might, or careless people might. Now, what happens is this. The first trouble you have with your questions is that they may not be addressed really at the question, properly at the question of intention, if you are trying to get at intention.
The intention to vote,
To vote,
mean?
which way you're going to vote. This is if you're trying to say what's going to happen. And even if you're going to try to find out what the feeling is now, you'll find that the different polling organisations have different questions. And last time, there were as many different questions as their polling organisations. And if I can just give you an example of that, and you've heard some, how would you vote if there was a general election tomorrow? That's one. Here's another one. Which party will you vote for? If you vote, which candidate will you support? And so on. And so they are in fact not the same question. And that's one of the important things.
Well, this explains the confusion that the public has, because you see so many different results. I think there's almost a 14% spread now, is there not, with some polls about the Liberals?
Yes.
And the public, I think, will come to distrust all results. Now, is this due to increased, I think the in word for this election is volatility. The volatile voter, which I thought was just our old friend, the floating voter, in a new guise.
Well, he is, yes. I mean, I think that volatility is a separate question from this thing about the difference between all the different polls, except that the different polls are, of course, carried out at different times, and therefore could both be accurate, measuring a different moment in time.
You want to have it both ways.
No, but I mean, having said that, I mean, I do think that obviously good polls taken even at the same time come up with different answers.
But how
and
would
actually
you
this is, if I may say so, is in the public interest, because if you had just one poll, it would be regarded as authoritative, and people would have a much less good understanding, even than they have now, of what is meant by a margin of error and what are the different sources of error. If you have a series of different polls with different results, this does actually help to educate people.
Or it can just confuse people.
This is a very costly way of educating them in terms of money spent on research, isn't it? I know you don't mean that entirely, but you see, you have an additional problem. It's not just a question of they're being different, but questions can be misunderstood. In fact, anyone who studies the way questions are interpreted will find all sorts of strange things happening. They're not always obvious. You know, like the word you being interpreted as you and your wife, or your husband in some cases. Like people turning weekday into all days of the week. And in this particular, one of the things that does happen quite a lot is that people add their own little reservation. For instance, they'll say, I will vote so-and-so, but to themselves they say, if they give me a firm assurance of such and such before election day. But you don't know that, and so there's an extra type of interpretation built into it. There are things you can do, but these are the problems.
This is the internal feelings that nobody can register by a yes or a no or a maybe or a don't know.
Well, perhaps they could, but they are not always answering the question that they're asked. We change the question sometimes to suit ourselves.
But the fact remains, we see these enormous headlines, surging ahead, startling results. Is there a danger that public opinion polls, accurate or no, will influence the eventual outcome of any election?
I think
it does worry me, I must admit.
Well, I think it has, the polls, in fact, of course, have many influences at many different levels. There's no doubt at all that they will always influence the whole political climate. If the polls are showing one party well ahead at the beginning of an election, the way in which that election is both fought and the way in which the newspapers or television cameras report it will actually be conditioned by the fact that people think, from the polls, that one party or the other is actually ahead. And this, I think, is inevitable.
Doesn't this make you feel very, very responsible?
Yes.
Doesn't it worry you?
Well, we feel a considerable load of responsibility to do the best possible job we can.
Do you think that you're interfering with the logical process of democracy?
I think we sometimes contribute to it.
Can I just read you a quote from one
Sure.
of your recent articles where you say, the polls not only undermine the politician's claim to represent the electorate, they also cast doubt on his ability to understand it and to predict how it will react to events. So that you're in conflict with the politicians themselves. And who governs the country?
Well, what I was saying in that article is that politicians will always hate the opinion polls, whether they're accurate or inaccurate. Not all politicians, but in general there will be a hostility between politicians and polls, because before polls came along, politicians could claim that they were representing public opinion on any particular issue, wherever they were, even if in fact 90% of the public was opposed to them. Now, if polls show that that's untrue, their position is undermined.
Dr. Wilson.
I think that I'd go along with that to some extent. I think that the poll can, at its best, inform people about the situation. Now, I think it might be very useful to be informed as we go along. We don't have to shut our eyes and go in the dark. In fact, I think some people may in fact be waiting to decide whether to cast their vote this way or that way, saying it's wasted if the party is a very, very small one, it's not going to get in, and it's not wasted if there's a chance of getting in. Of course, that's a bandwagon effect, as you know.
But then that changes the original intent of the voter.
Indeed. If you take the Liberal vote in this election, I strongly believe that the opinion polls have, not intentionally, but have in fact helped to increase, so far, the Liberal bandwagon. Because we know from our polls that there are many, many millions of people who are quite attracted by the idea of voting Liberal, rightly or wrongly, and that they haven't done so in the past, simply because the polls have shown that the Liberals were really, at best, a very small factor in the election. When the polls show, as they have done, that the Liberals are really doing rather well, then many of these people may be tempted to move over and actually vote Liberal. I should say it could work the other way.
This temptation is based upon a belief that a scientific truth is evidenced by poll results, and you both gone to great lengths to convince me that there is no scientific truth in your results.
It's a matter of degree. A great many of the results that are coming out, I would expect to be pretty near the mark. It's a question really of knowing which ones are really highly dependable and which of those are the other way out ones. But there's one point I'd just like to slip in here. You know, this influence effect can work another way. If people see, for instance, that their party is going a bad way, it's dropping down, they may suddenly come to the rescue of the party. That's another type of special effect that it can have.
I am worried about one thing. If the polls have the influence that they appear to have, they are, to me, a sort of offshoot of market research where a product is sold. Isn't there a danger that politicians and their policies will be tailored to fit consumer demand?
Well,
which is a reverse, in a sense, of consensus politics.
Well, is it? I mean, if somebody finds out that the public is feeling this, and this, well, and suppose you really want to meet them, to do something for them, I think you have an opportunity to take into consideration what people are really thinking. This may well be a tool of democracy.
But there are two answers to this, in fact. I mean,
yes,
one
because you said earlier, Dr. Belson, that the right questions were not being asked, so we don't know what the public wants.
If I can, it seems to me that this is where it's very important to have more than one poll, because the different polls are measuring things and asking different questions, which does actually give politicians a much better read on public opinion than they would ever get from one poll. And of course the opportunities for abuse are pretty small if you've got several polls competing with each other to be more accurate than the others. I mean, I think it's a slightly strange argument to say that because the polls all show that 80 or 90% of the people are very concerned about prices, that the politicians will start doing something about prices, or trying to do something about prices. Or alternatively, that if 70% of them are for hanging, that this will necessarily mean that MPs will vote for hanging, because of course they haven't done, knowing full well that the majority of the population would like hanging.
No, it's a matter of degree, of course. It means they don't shut their eyes completely to the picture that the public is presenting.
Well, I hope not. Gentlemen, may I thank you for your opinions about the opinion polls, and perhaps next year we'll meet again and say what went wrong or what went right last time. Thank you very much. Thank you, too, for joining us. See you next week after the election. Bye-bye.